Reporters for Vice News travel the world, putting a human face to the world's most important stories. But now, we introduce you to them.
This position is now under direct fire.
Go, go, go!
This is Field Notes, a show that sits down with our reporters to find out the stories behind their stories and how they got so close to the action.
This is another example of Lebanese people taking matters into their own hands.
American journalists!
In this episode, we hear from the team that investigated the culture of no-compromise gun ownership, industry money, and political dysfunction that has made it so difficult to create meaningful change in the U.S.
Go, go!
Shooter ready, stand by.
Why did you decide to leave the firearms industry?
It got to a point in the firearms industry where you had to accept irresponsible behaviors, you had to celebrate them, and you had to market them to stay in. And I looked around and I thought, what the hell have we created here?
The Second Amendment of the Constitution was not written so I can go deer hunting. The Second Amendment was written to protect the entire Constitution from a tyrannical government like we have right now.
Will you stop talking about Sandy Hook?
You're the guys that talk about Sandy Hook.
Will you stop?
I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about Sandy Hook. You do.
Do you understand the pain that these families have gone through?
What's your outlook on whether or not this can change?
I think a lot of people my age are to the point where we just kind of accepted that this is what life in America is.
Thank you guys for joining me. Really interested to hear a lot more about this documentary about guns and mass shootings. I understand you guys went across the country. It's sort of marked for the 10-year anniversary of the Sandy Hook shootings, but there's also so much more. So I wonder if you could just start with talking to me about the scope. Like, where did you go? And, how did you decide the angle into the story? I'll start with you, Liz.
We were asked by one of the executive producers of our show, Nikki, to do something that would be different than what everybody else was going to be covering around the 10 years since Sandy Hook. So we started this conversation back in April of last year. And the idea was to look at why this country has so many mass shootings. A mass shooting is defined as 4 or more people shot, not including the shooter. There are hundreds of them every year across this country. So we decided to go across the country to speak with different stakeholders. We were just sort of reminiscing on where we had gone. We went all the way to Montana. We were down in Texas. We were in Connecticut for one of the trials, also where Sandy Hook is. So this really did take us all over the country to get the scope of why the United States is the only country in the world that has this problem.
Yeah, I think it was a case of also finding the people who, as I said, are affected by this, but also have something to gain or lose from this as well. So, we spent some time in DC as well, where we're all based, to try and understand, who are the sort of puppet masters behind all of this, who's, getting the most money out of it, and who's kind of pulling the strings as well. And that kind of led to one of our really, really key interviews with the head of the NSSF, key lobbyist there, who they're a lobbying group that has huge sway and kind of unknown sway within the gun lobbying space. We often talk about the NRA, but actually the NSSF is sort of the key puppet master behind everything right now in terms of the legislation they're lobbying to ensure that gun reform is next to impossible.
And this history is very long, obviously, right? Not only legislatively, but the Supreme Court, like the Heller decision that sort of codified the Second Amendment as a right to have a gun. And then the AR-15 as a gun itself is something that figures very heavily, obviously, because it's used in so many of the tragic mass shootings that we see. So I guess, how did you find that these lobbying firms or lobbying interests shape the way that gun policy is enacted? Because I think something that's so as a citizen, as a person who sees it happen over and over again, is you see victims and you see their families and you understand how devastating this is. And you saw that by talking to so many of the people who have been affected by gun violence. But I guess put the pieces together for me as to how lobbying of this kind affects the next mass shooting, so to speak.
We were curious to figure out how lobbying and the business of gun ownership informs and impacts the culture, because we saw those two things as being the answers to the question, why does the US have so many mass shootings? You have the business and you have the culture, like which came first, chicken and the egg situation. And what we found was that the business side, the lobbyists, the NRA, and now the NSSF had done a really remarkable job creating the perfect customer. And that perfect customer was somebody who was heavily invested in a anti-government culture. So anti-establishment culture, anti-government culture, like one gun isn't enough. You have to have as many guns as you can in order to defend yourself from government overreach. And as we began to explore that relationship between the money and the culture, it was interesting because we saw how the culture had actually moved further right than even the business could keep up with. And it was described to us by one of our subjects as being this brush fire, this kind of uncontrollable brush fire, where now you have business interests and politicians who are scrambling to keep up with how extreme the culture has become. And that was really one of the reasons we saw this issue of mass shootings as being so hard to control.
Yeah, and did you find sort of a connection between the culture and then the inability to get policy sort of passed?
Yeah, and I think to your question of how did it become normalized from these military engagements into kind of everyday society, you had the sunsetting of the assault weapons ban, war in the Middle East, and then also the rise of political extremism and Barack Obama becoming president. So it was really shocking to see how much assault weapons sales spiked when Obama became president, and it was this period of intense paranoia. So even though not all gun owners in America were fighting overseas, a lot of people who were experiencing political paranoia or be drawn to the more extreme ends of political culture became interested in gun ownership. That became more and more people over time, and it's kind of representative of this right-wing consumer base that politicians are chasing after, and that's preventing those same politicians from passing legislation that could help curtail gun sales.
And that kind of all comes together in the character of Alex Jones in some way, doesn't it?
Yeah. I was going to say, Madeline is explaining this well and leading perfectly up to why we went to the Alex Jones trial. Sandy Hook families sued him and won in this trial in Connecticut last fall. And Alex Jones, for years on his InfoWars conspiracy television radio shows, would say that Sandy Hook was a false flag, that the US government was somehow involved in it in order to take away people's guns, called the parents crisis actors, which is a horrific thing to say to someone who lost their child in a mass shooting. So we went to that trial as kind of a lens into how a whole, group of people in this country have become politically paranoid and therefore have taken that and wanted to purchase more guns. I think Alex Jones encouraged that with some people. And that trial was a pretty good culmination of those things. And it was wild to be there in person, honestly, and to sort of see him defending what he had spewed for so long.
This judge is ordering me to say that I'm guilty and to say that I'm a liar. They've misrepresented what I've said and done, and they have continued to use my name to fundraise for their gun control organizations.
Alex, do you understand the pain? Do you understand
I say to them that I didn't murder your children.
Will you stop talking about Sandy?
You're the guys that talk about Sandy Hook. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about Sandy Hook. You do. You live off of it.
Do you understand the pain that these families have gone through?
And then there's a nexus between misinformation and disinformation in the case of Alex Jones towards saying, hey, these terrible events didn't happen, right? So they're trying to take your guns, which is a very political statement, and it kind of rallies an extremist base sometimes to say something like that. And I'm thinking about pieces that the DC Bureau has done, such as people harassing and calling into election workers. And so we talk about guns and we talk about the politics behind them, but there's so many different strands that it touches in what you guys cover. So I guess my question on the extremism side is it is a kind of political violence if you really kind of think about it, because it's so politicized as an issue that every time we see one of these, a mass shooting that happens for any number of different reasons. For instance, recently for the Lunar New Year, there was a mass shooting in California. Now that wasn't an AR-15, but it was a banned, extended clip. So it's like every time one of these tragedies happens, it reflects upon the politics of our time as well. So that's a broad question, I know, but I guess sort of putting those those pieces together in your reporting is what I'm interested in talking about.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely like a normalization of political violence, I think, across the board, and we've been covering that for years now. But I think it's also a disconcerting political story to tell because, like, to actually be in the Capitol, like Liz and I were at the end of that piece, and talking to senators who have the ability to do something about it, and they're so disinterested in even addressing the question is like unbelievable. I remember after Uvalde, we went to the Capitol and there was like a protest above ground with all these parents who had just lost their kids. And then we went to the basement to track down some senators and ask them about it. And it was like, it was a vacation day for them. It was totally dead. Like we were trying to ask them questions. There was like so little energy around this event that had like almost like mobilized the entire country at that moment. Like right after Uvalde, we were like, it felt like there was such a collective grief. And just the experience of being like not like 500 feet away from these grieving parents in the basement of the Senate where these people like didn't really seem to care at all was so bizarre and so spooky. And like we were there for the end of our documentary trying to ask about another mass shooting that had just happened in Virginia and like how much money these senators were getting from the gun lobby, and like they hadn't really even seemed that prepared to answer questions about it, even though we were there like the day after a mass shooting, because it was just so normal that this kind of violence would be happening. Like what they really wanted to talk about was like McCarthy becoming the speaker, or like who are they going to vote for. There was a real disconnect, I think, between like the reality of the suffering and the kind of like political machinations below ground.
One thing I was also struck by is sort of the graphics that you guys used to communicate just how many mass shootings there were and how you focus in on individual mass shootings as a result, but that formed a backbone to really, you think about like the just tapestry of number of mass shootings there are.
Every line passing by now is a massacre. A mass shooting means 4 or more people shot or killed, not including the shooter. Over the past decade, there have been more than 4,000 of them, 600 this year alone. The tragedies are so frequent, they blend together.
The deadly shooting at an elementary school, and it is turning out to be worse than anyone could have imagined.
While each one is a national news story, there's a routine to how it plays out. Shock and horror giving way to thoughts and prayers.
Tonight, everyone in this arena and every citizen across the land sends our prayers to the victims and their families. We all do.
We hear from mourning family members and friends about their loved ones whose lives were cut short.
He's just a wonderful person. She'd give anything for those kids. Anything, even her life.
And if the death toll is high enough or the victims young enough, the president might visit the scene.
I am sick and tired of it. Why are we willing to live with this carnage? Why do we keep letting this happen?
Our editor was amazing. She was incredible, and we actually all said when she was editing, I was like, are you okay? While looking through, particularly the news reports of these mass shootings, they are so cyclical and so horrific just to watch, children like leaving buildings, particularly schools, running out, being that traumatized, hearing from victims' families. I think without sort of hitting the viewer over the head with this, we did want to kind of remind the viewer that it's easy to forget and it's easy to confuse mass shootings. Like, no, that was actually in 2017, and no, that one was at this school, not that school. And I think that kind of reminds the viewer that this is chronic, persistent, and isn't going away anytime soon. And so I think that was like one of the tools we wanted to use graphics to do in this piece at least.
And how did you contend with the overwhelming element of it?
I found that filming this was quite dark. And I have been covering gun policy issues for a number of years. This was my first time actually going to the scene of a mass shooting. That was what Madeline and I deployed to in St. Louis, and being on the ground there for that and speaking with some of these young students. I think I was very worried that I would be really emotional on camera. I kept it together for the interviews, but it was so emotional hearing from them. The parents in Uvalde, Brett and Javier, are amazing people, and they opened their homes to us, which is like so generous of them to allow cameras into a very sacred space where they have many memories of their children that they lost. Yeah, it takes a toll, and I am not the parent of a child that's been shot. I'm not the spouse or the sister or brother, so you think about the collective grief, I think, that this nation experiences with mass shootings. Think about these families in Monterey Park in California that are beginning their journey of grief after losing people. And it is a very heavy weight to bear for this nation.
You know, one of the parents you talked to in Uvalde said something that stuck with me, which is like, these lawmakers aren't going to do anything about it because it's not their kids that are getting shot.
The sounds of children screaming have been removed was the caption that played right before they released the hallway video. Their screams weren't just removed from that video. Their voices have been silenced completely. The flag upside down, our country is in distress right now, and we have to do something.
Yeah.
What are the changes that you want to see?
I want laws that are common sense that can prevent these things. And I fear that most of this country and all of the government and everything, it's not going to change their minds because it wasn't their kids.
And so there's something like very hard about this trauma and very animating about this trauma when people actually do see it. And I think part of what was compelling about this film is how you guys used the Bodycam footage from the Uvalde shooting. Talk to me about using that, because it is really traumatic to watch, or it is it's upsetting to watch. But I thought you guys used it in a very discreet and interesting way. How did you contend with that?
It was interesting you mentioned that, because there was a moment that it was in the piece and I had been watching it a bunch of times and I was like, should we just cut this body cam footage? I think it was more my personal reaction to having to watch it a bunch of times. But as Shrey was mentioning, it's kind of the process of remembering how severe and horrific that event was. And I think even Uvalde had kind of become a headline in my head, but seeing the body cam footage really brought it to light. I think a big conversation in this film was how much violence we wanted to show versus what the editorial payoff would be. There's definitely a line where we didn't want to introduce just so much violence that someone couldn't watch the film. But the Uvalde scene was so important to us and those parents were so important to us that we were we should spend the time and really use these visuals, because we have to set up what the stakes are. We have to remember how bad it was so that by the time we're at the end talking to the gun lobby, those images are still with us. And I think something that was difficult was that when we were talking to the gun lobbies or the lawmakers at the end, we weren't able to bring those visuals with us. I think there's a part of me that was I wish I could have just combined these two people in the room and been now you guys have to reckon with, or the lobby needs to reckon with the pain that's been felt. But that obviously is not our job in this situation. But the visuals really tell that story in a way that I think an interview can't on its own.
And I guess last question, because it's about the lobby, and I want to come back to that because that was so much of the crux of your investigation here. Is yes, the NRA might be sunsetting in some weird ways, but it will go on. How does the gun lobby reconcile the clear difference in the way that the United States has mass shootings and other countries don't? What is their story? How do they square the circle on this?
We try to explore that with Larry Keane, who is the head lobbyist for the NSSF, the National Shooting Sports Foundation. And they are filling the void that the NRA has left because of all of their own internal issues with that organization.
Has there ever been a shooting or a tragedy in the recent past that has given you pause about your work, what you do at the NSSF?
Like all Americans, people in the firearm industry, certainly people that work at NSSF, abhor the criminal misuse of firearms. We think these are horrible tragedies, but we don't believe that our advocacy work on behalf of our industry is responsible for these tragedies.
But I mean, in Uvalde, we saw 19 students who were killed with an AR-15. Is that not a time to look at how deadly that weapon is?
That weapon is no more deadly than any other firearm. So we see that as just exploiting tragedy for political gain.
I think he knows a lot of powerful lawmakers and influences policy in a pretty serious way. And he said he does not feel like the work that he does is responsible for mass shootings. And, I think that is the main answer you hear from these pro-Second Amendment groups, is that being armed, being supportive of the Second Amendment and guns in this country, they don't see the connection to mass violence and mass shooting. They see those events related to mental health, to Josh Hawley talked about masculinity and manhood. The judicial system was something that Ted Cruz said to us. So I think that there are, other things that these lobbyists and that these lawmakers who are against major gun safety reform will tell you.
And I suppose part of the film is letting viewers decide for themselves, like how do these pieces fit together? How do they not fit together?
I guess I'd also say about like, how does the lobby or how do these lawmakers reckon with the epidemic of mass shooting is that, like, they don't have to. Like, I don't think that we can put the question to them, but there's no like source of accountability that's going to force them to reckon with what's happening. Because if it had happened, if it could have, it would have happened already. Like, I think that was a big impression I got from both the lobbyists and the senators was like, there's no kind of like, there's very little outside forces that's like going to move their decision making. So there's not like a lot of critical thinking around the way that they see guns in relationship to this violence, because they already have their talking points. They can talk about, well, it's mostly criminals on the street who are shooting, or like laws won't prevent this, or whatever, masculinity. But like they can just easily like be in and out of an interview with us and then like continue to be really successful in their jobs. And that's like, I don't know where else that accountability can come from.
And I think Liz says this in the piece, and we talk about it as well, that if business is good, why would you want to hinder an impact business? And fundamentally and cynically, that is ultimately a bottom line. It's a bottom line industry where sales are doing well and it's enshrined in the Constitution. So.
Well, thank you guys for this reporting. I know it must not have been easy, and it was quite an undertaking given how far you went and how many places, but it raised a lot of questions, and I think it's a conversation that isn't over.
I'm Michael Learmonth, editor-in-chief of Vice News. Too often, traditional news outlets shy away from the real stories and experiences of those living through global conflicts. Not Vice News. Our reporters are on the ground, fearlessly covering the human stories that shape our world. You and millions of others can continue to read, watch, and listen to Vice News for free. But we hope you'll consider making a one-time or ongoing contribution of any size at vice.com/contribute. Every contribution, no matter how big or small, helps support the journalism Vice News brings to you every day. Thank you.